so thrilled to be gathered together this evening. Thank you all for being here. Actually, virtually, my name is Ann Brennan. I'm director of Cameron Art Museum. And we're in the galleries of a solo retrospective exhibition of work by, all of this work created by one artist. His name is Stephen Hayes, and the exhibition is entitled Voices of Futures Past. With us this evening is Zedrik, Applin. Our deputy director, Heather Bolson, and I met Zedrick over lunch a while back. And we were so captivated to walk through this exhibition with you, Zedrick. We just said, would you consider doing a tour one evening? And I think Zedrick's from this minute doesn't know how to say no.
Yes.
And so agreed to join us this evening. Zedrick's been working for Encino since 2019, moved newly to Wilmington only 3 years ago. And he leapt forward as Encino's first program manager of diversity, equity, inclusion, and community. Encino is very much a community-first culture, and Zedrick, you're a major leader toward that end. His role includes overseeing Encino's philanthropic programs, including its community service team called Involve. Just listen, this is one small example of what Involve is involved in. Involve volunteers supported more than 50 nonprofit organizations, which you know intimately, everyone, including the Food Bank of Central and Eastern North Carolina, Wilmington Area Rebuilding Ministry, WARM, New Hanover Regional Medical Center Community Garden, and the Honor Foundation. It's a career transition program for U.S. Special Ops Forces. Zedrick, we're so surprised you have even any time to be with us tonight. Thank you so much. It's such an honor.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. It is my pleasure and my honor to do this. I got a chance to meet these lovely individuals. As we said, we had lunch, and she was showing me the exhibit, and I had a chance to view the exhibit on the same day that we unveiled Boundless, and I was here for that ceremony. And I remember walking through the exhibit and was just overwhelmed, kind of about the spirit of the day, and then seeing what was here in the exhibit. And so when she asked me to come and kind of give my perspective, I couldn't say no. I'm a person who is a first lover of the arts. I was a performing arts person. Have no creative talent bone in my body to create pieces like this. But art like this always gives a message, not only of honesty, but also of hope in a lot of things that we do. So thank you for allowing me to give my perspective as we walk through this exhibit. And we'll start here, kind of at our first piece that we're seeing. The one thing I love as I've kind of walked through this exhibit before is Stephen Hayes' use of different materials, textures throughout his artwork that really conveys the message. And if you see here in this his very first piece here in the exhibit, it's called Kairos. Kairos is the Greek word for to seize the opportunity, to take an advantage. And if you think about the exhibit and what we're really conveying here, we're talking voices of futures past. You see how this particular piece cast in iron actually kind of symbolizes a ship's wheel, where you see the fists kind of acting as the oars or the mounts that come off a ship. And if you think about the African American experience in our journey here to America, we were brought here on ships with wheels just like this. And so you talk about taking or seizing an opportunity. You think about the opportunity that those who brought us here took and saw that, hey, we saw what they could do in Africa. Let's bring them to America and have them build our country. And so it was a seizing of an opportunity that happened. But I want to start and end here because after we kind of walk through this, I want to take a different perspective on this piece as we've had a chance to view the art and kind of give what then this piece then means to me after seeing the rest of this exhibit. So let's start here. If we look behind you, you'll see the medians of the presidents or the faces on most of our American money, or all of our American money, starting from the dollar bill all the way to the $100 bill. And this is real critical, real crucial in what we're talking about here because these individuals here on that are faced on our money, and not only on the dollars but also on our coins, many of them were slave owners. Many of them had slaves. Many of them were proponents of slavery at the inception of this country. Really what drew this country is very a capitalistic society that profited off the backs of African Americans, Africans that came to this country. And so I love his use of kind of starting with how we got here and really what was the driver behind the building and the establishment of this country. There was an ideal that what this country wanted to be, but a lot of it was fueled really by the capitalistic part of our country, which was centered in money. And so it's really kind of juxtaposition that you would have some of our founding forefathers that are on the face of money, but that many of them were also proponents of slavery. And so I really like this piece and how he's kind of shown in a very large way of really the origins of this country and really was built off of really was the money that was made by these individuals and the money that was kept from the ones that really made this country go. And so I love this piece and how he used just the arts and textures of just simple monies, things that we see every day, things that we transact with every day in the society, but that really was the origin and foundation of the lack and disparity what we see in this country today. But then I like how he transitions, and so as you transition kind of into the story here, you see these pieces behind you. This first piece here is entitled Queen Cotton and Girl Cotton. So if you know anything, me living in Texas, especially living out in West Texas when I went to college at Texas Tech University, I used to drive by fields and acres and acres and acres of cotton farms. West Texas probably produces 60% of the nation's cotton. And so when I see cotton farms, I'm always kind of transported back to a time when most of the people who picked cotton in the slavery days were the women, and the young girls out in the field were the ones who picked cotton. My actual grandmother picked cotton out in West Texas back in the early, probably had the early 1930s, 1940s. She would travel out to West Texas during the harvest season to actually pick cotton. And I remember my mom, she told me the story. How she didn't want to be left home because she would travel. My mom lived in East Texas and would travel out to West Texas. She's like, I didn't want to be left home with my grandmother. I wanted to go with my mom. I wanted to see what pick cotton felt like. My mother stayed out there all of about 2 hours to pick cotton. She's like, then there, I know I didn't want to do this as a profession at all. She's like, that's why I focused on my education, so that's something I would not have to do. But in my family, that's where my legacy comes from. I am the direct descendants of slaves in Alabama. I can trace back my lineages to about 1860, to where my great-great-great-grandfather was a slave in Alabama, was purchased by a slave owner that lived in Texas, and was walked from Alabama to Texas because slaves couldn't ride in wagons, they had to walk. And so that is my lineage of where I came from. And so in seeing these pieces, knowing that my direct descendants that I could trace back were pickers of cotton. Many of them women that were out in the fields doing a lot of the picking, while the men did most of the heavy work of tilling the farm and raising the animals and things of that nature. And so he gives this ode to women kind of in the first part of the exhibit. So if we transition to behind you, he calls this, I forget what this piece is called. He calls this piece the support token. So if growing up in the black family, the African American family, the matriarchs of the family were the backbones. I think about my mother, my grandmother, really were the backbones of our family, the ones that were supportive, the ones that were the nurturers, a lot of times the correctors of the children, but really the ones that kept things in line and in order, not only in the home, but outside of the home as well. I was a product of being raised not only by my mothers, but their friends, my aunts, their neighbors up the street. If I was out of line when I was outside of my parents' care, there were many of these women that would correct me then and then tell my mother when I got home. And so she made sure that I got as much correction as I could as to prevent future embarrassment to the family. But if you look at kind of some of the pieces, the odes to some of the elders, and so you see the piece here where you can kind of trace back to some of the African tribes that used to do some of the piercings, and so you see a lot of the different types of our women's, our ancestors, throughout the continental Africa on how they wore their hair, how they dressed, how they had different jewelry pieces that were then used, that were then at times lost in the transition from, in the slave ships from Africa to the U.S. If you travel back to Africa, many of these traditions still live in some of the tribes and areas in the countries that are there. But if you think about it, most of those who were brought from Africa to the U.S., a lot of those traditions and passed downs were lost in that transition. So I like how he kind of builds this ode to the woman, not only to the black woman here in America, but also giving ode to the black woman with their roots in Africa. And so if you transition to back here, not only does he give us ode to black women, but this piece in here, if you move this way, please. I like how he uses, Stephen Hayes uses a mixture of mediums to really convey a message. So not only does he use sculpture, but he also uses audio from many of the casts that were taken of friends, people that he knew, of giving an ode to what the black man has meant, not only to those here in America, but what kind of an ode to our many different, we're not a monolithic people. So you have many people with different hairstyles, textures, bald, right here, dreads. We are not a monolithic person. And so when you talk about the black man, or when you talk about the black man in America, we come in many different shades, facets, backgrounds. But I think one thing that is a unifying piece is our skin color sticks out. Our skin color is the one thing that, regardless of what shade you are, you're still considered a black man. And so I like how he uses the darker tones to really convey our skin really is the first thing that a lot of people see. And to some it's beautiful. I like how he uses the light to really portray how the melanin within our skin really absorbs the light, but to others it can be fearful. We hear a lot of stories and have seen a lot of things in the media and the news recently of police shootings of young black men, and the police would say they were in fear for their lives. when the individuals were not armed. And a lot of times it comes from the melanin in our skin produces fear in some people. And if you hear the stories that are being told by the men that were cast, they're telling kind of some of their experiences that they have experienced as black men in this country, the things that they've had to overcome, the prejudices that they've had to come up against. And a lot of times, just because of them being who they are, being the way that their hair grows out of their head, being how they, just the person who they are when they wake up in the morning is oftentimes you're given 2 strikes against you before you walk out the door. And so I think it's a testament to people have to understand understand there's a story behind every person that we come in contact with. Each individual, especially our black men, have a story of triumph, have a story of having to overcome, but also have a story sometimes of fearfulness for their own lives. Me being young, I'm 38 years old. I've lived in metropolitan cities. I've moved here to Wilmington. I've got small children myself, and a small son, 6 years old. And at 6, I have to give him the talk about how to act, about how to operate around adults. Because oftentimes, given whatever setting that you're in, even at a young age,
I was never told.
He has been cast as that other child, or that if he acts out, he's a bad child, and he's been labeled a moniker just because he's the only one that looks like him in the class. So I have to give him these talks and understanding that growing up, you're going to look like dad one day. And oftentimes people will give you, people will be nice to you, and some people will treat you differently just because of the way you look. It's like, don't give them any other fuel to pass any other judgment against you just because of the way you look. And so I think we often have to understand and hear the stories of many of our black men and what they go through just stepping out the door every day. So I love how the first part of his exhibit kind of talks about not only what's the foundation of our country, but the people of this country that built it and owed to the family unit in the black culture, and what really that means to him. And what it means to be black in America here in the U.S. But then I love how he transitions into this. And if we go to the second part of the exhibit, he really extends this conversation. Really the origin the African people in the class. So if you look to my left or right, you can see the beginning of the exhibit. That is cast into different materials, the wood blocks that are represented in the wooden ships that were brought here. But each of these casts, as you look, represent how slaves were transported on these slave ships to the U.S. The tight quarters and people had to lay head to foot and really were bound within these ships. To make it across the middle passage here to the U.S. Many of the slaves did not make it across this passage. There was a lot of disease that was captured. People died for lack of nourishment. But millions and millions of slaves made this journey. And I remember, I'll reference one of my favorite movies now, Black Panther. When I first saw it, at the end of the movie, at the very end, when T'Challa and I forget the other character, played by Michael B. Jordan, he makes a statement at the end of the movie because T'Challa was trying to help him. Like, can I get you some help? You can survive this? He's like, no, bury me in the ocean, because he's like, I would rather die with my ancestors and live as a slave. And understanding that many of the slaves did not want to be slaves in America. They said they would rather die in the ocean rather than be a slave on a foreign land where they have no rights, no control, and they were just seen as chattel and cattle and property for people to own. And so he makes this larger than life exhibit to really to give the impression of how many slaves were really brought here, how many passages, how many transports were done kind of from this middle passage in the slave trade in Africa. And so it's the largesse of the exhibit of this portion of it really goes to show you that many of the foundations in this country started here on these ships, started from our African ancestors being transported in close quarters where they were shackled, where they were given not much food to survive, and brought to a land that was foreign to them, that they didn't know anyone, didn't own anything, had no property, and were considered property. That was the origin that a lot that's not talked about in this country. You know, I don't want to politicize this, and I don't care what side of the coin you are. But the origin of America is deeply rooted in a lot of our origin is seen throughout how America operates today. And I think that's kind of what Stephen was trying to convey, is that there is a untold story, or a undoing of a story that is important to our story as African American individuals here, and it's important to the story of America that we have to reckon and wrestle with our origin here as a country. And so I think with the largesse of the exhibit, he's trying to bring a light to there is a story that we still have to have a conversation with, because we are still dealing with the effects of this today, whether we want to believe it or not. And so if you transition to this middle piece here, this was the piece that really struck me when I came here. And it represents the slave trade and really how we were auctioned off, really as property. We were many auction blocks where we were brought to, we were paraded around to show what our physical prowess was, and many people the price of the slave would go up based on whether or not they were physically fit, whether they could endure many of the toils, what it took to raise a farm or really be this worker on a lot of these plantations or farms where they were placed at. Many of our children were separated from parents, and it speaks to really the lack of humanity that we were seen as. We were seen as property. We were seen as 3/5 of a person. It was written into our documents until the early 1800s. And even through all of that, we still have overcome as a people. And that's what I really kind of took away from this exhibit, is that if you look at the origins, if you look at how we have come as a people, our story begins, as African Americans, begins here. But even through all that, we've overcome. And that's kind of, I like how this exhibit kind of really transitions to the origin, and then how we really transition as a culture and as a people kind of throughout the rest of his work. I like his use of farm animals that he used. So he has horses here within this artwork. It's a beautiful piece of artwork. But a lot of our history began as we were the keepers of all of the animals. We were the farmers. We were the laborers. We were those who kept things going. And to really have a horse as a farm animal to work for you, you have to break it. And so that's what I like about this larger piece here. Kind of talks to about the breaking of the horse. So many of you have kind of been around farming, especially around horses. No one gets on a horse that hasn't been birthed. A horse is a wild animal. It is not prone to be ridden on or tamed. And so you have to go through a process really of breaking the horse. I actually have my cousin. He raises horses. He got the degree in equine sciences. And so he breeds and he raises a lot of horses. So I'll talk to him about how you get the horses. Back in Texas, that there were a lot of cowboys, and many of the cowboys were black. People don't know that they're raised for cowboys as well. So we have this history in our family. We have a lot of black cowboys. And so that was kind of his ode to the family, to really grow up raising cowboys. I mean, he's a cowboy when he grew. But he talks about the process of breaking a horse and how it really takes a long time for a horse to kind of lose its spirit. His first nature, of course, his first nature is to run, to be wild, to be free, to break that spirit so that you could ride it, to have to be domesticated, to do what you need to do, is a process. And that's what it took for many of the slaves here. If you read through the stories of Old Lynch and how he really brought the process of how to break the horse here to the U.S. And many of those tactics that were used by the Lynch, where the term lynching from, were used by the slave masters to effectively tame the horse. Because our people did not want to be subjugated. They did not want to be free. There were many slave uprisings that were brought down by many of the armed white farmers. And there's stories like that haven't been told and often aren't told in history. We were not a people that were just going to be subjugated. There were fightbacks, there were uprisings, and even through all of that, we still survived. We still came. And so one of my favorite pieces, actually, aside from that one, is this one right here in the middle, called Jesus Piece. I was a Kanye West fan before Kanye is Kanye today. And so he has a song called Jesus Walk, and y'all know what it is, Jesus Piece. And many of the African entertainers also wear these big necklaces and chains that have this Jesus piece on. It's kind of ode to today's culture. But when I think about it, I think about how religion really plays a large part of the sustainment and really how many of our people were able to really survive what they went through. Having their own churches and slavery, really singing a lot of the Negro spirituals that we hear today. Those pieces were intricate to the survival of the slave today. Even this piece really juxtaposes even the usage of religion against the slave too. Many of the passages within the Bible were often used against or used by the slave masters out of context to further subjugate many of our people back in the day. But we use religion as well as a piece to sustain us, to drive us. And many of the Negro spirituals that were sung and used as cadence in the fields to really get people. So I love just how layered really this piece is. Kind of if you think about it in kind of depth, that on its surface seems just, hey, that's kind of a replica of a piece that I've seen on a chain. If you think about it in the context of this exhibit, it really kind of gives two sides of how religion was used as a sustaining factor, but also as a factor against us people as well. And why many of our young individuals now today have issues with religion when they think about the history of how it was used. It's kind of one of the last other pieces I want to talk about. I'm going to look back to our original. This piece is called 5 Pounds. If any of you are gun owners or former military or have been to a concealed weapons class, they'll teach you that to fire a bullet takes 5 pounds of pressure. 5 pounds of pressure stands between life and death most of the time. 5 pounds of pressure stood between the life of Breonna Taylor, the life of George Floyd, the life of many of people who have died unneededly at the hands of police and sometimes at the hands of each other. 5 pounds of pressure is all it takes. And so if you squeeze the trigger, you think about your index finger, that 5 pounds of pressure oftentimes is the difference between life and death. And so he uses this piece here to kind of tell a story of many things that he's saying. And a lot of the hands here I see as hands up, don't shoot. 5 pounds of pressure was the difference between life and death in many police shootings. 5 pounds of pressure is also many of the deaths between even our young people today with a lot of the gun violence that we see in the cities. And so he uses these bullet casings here to create the image. There's a lot of different size weapons, from 9mm to buckshots that are here, to all different types of guns that are being fired to use, that have been used today and over our past as an instrument between life and death in our communities. And I want to implore these individuals here that have influence over young people in the community to bring them here and talk about this piece. Really, your beef against me or another person, the difference between life and death and that is often just 5 pounds of pressure. And what can we do to prevent that 5 pounds from being used? What is our obligation as people to stop a lot of the gun violence that we're seeing here, not only in our nation, but here in the city of Wilmington? We're not immune to seeing stories of where 5 pounds of pressure have been used in many of the communities in and around here in the city of Wilmington, and here in the state of North Carolina, and here around the country. And so it's our obligation as people to tell the story that before you pull that trigger, all it takes is 5 pounds of pressure between death and life most of the time. And so I would like to end back at the piece that we started. When I originally went through this exhibit, and feel free to peruse all the rest of the art, I saw this piece first and had a perspective of it. Then after coming back, I have a different perspective of it now seeing the rest of the exhibit. And as I mentioned before, the title of this exhibit is Kairos, which means to take advantage, seize an opportunity. And so when I look at this now, and I look at the fist raised, I see that we have a different opportunity now to be seized in this moment. We're kind of in another precipice in our community where we have the opportunity really to take advantage of a time in our history where people's ears and minds are open to change that we want to see. And it's going to take the resistance against what's always been, the resistance against those who say this is the way that we've always done things and nothing else can be done. And we see it a lot in our young people now, that through the Black Lives Matter movements, not only were we saw people of color there, but there are all people there together fighting against a lot of the injustice that is going on in our country. And so we have an opportunity, a Kairos moment, if you will, to really seize an opportunity in this point in time to say, what am I going to do to turn the trajectory of what our origin story in this country has been to what our future could be. It's up to me, it's up to you, it's up to all of us to seize this Kairos moment. And that is my talk for you today. I thank y'all for coming, and Godspeed to you all. And thank you for those online. But feel free to peruse the rest of the art. I didn't talk about every piece, but there are some great exhibits here, some great pieces